Okay, I think this is the first event of our spring speaker series. We will have 4 or 5 talks, I don't remember many. That will be a very dense quarter for our speaker series. And our first speaker is Taija, correct pronunciation?
You got it.
Thank you. Taija McDougall and McDougall.
Never the one that
I cannot. And first of all, I'm very pleased to say that she will be the recipient of the postdoctoral, the presidential postdoc. So she will work with us, specifically with Bob Meister, for the next 2 years in our department. And I think it's really good. So we will have with her. She's also the author of a dissertation whose title is Blackness, Terminable, Interminable. And I think this is my understanding from the letters I signed, she will use these 2 years of a postdoc to turn the dissertation into a book publication. And the talk that he is delivering today is titled Plantations Derivations. So I don't want to take more time, and I give the floor to Taija.
Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you so much for bringing me, Max and Bob, to be part of now the spring speaker series. I was originally supposed to be the final winter speaker series person, but I flew a little too close to the COVID and got it, unfortunately. So really pleased to be here. And hello, everyone on Zoom. Lovely to see friends and strangers. I'll speak for close to 40 minutes today, and I'll only cry through part of it, I promise. But this presentation, Plantations Derivations, exists in a much shorter form alongside this one because of what it was originally drafted for. And so there's some clarifications I want to set out before moving into the body of the work and then its extension. Many years ago in my undergrad, I took a class on Leotard, which I was talking to Bob about today, and we read everything. And I was most struck at the time by the differend, the problem of incommensurability of writing and speaking in the face of the Holocaust stayed with me and became a fundamental part of my own work. Of course, though, we also read Jean-François' evil book, as he liked to call it, The Libidinal Economy. And this book drove me completely up the wall at the time. It still kind of drives me makes me a little uncomfortable. But it has, its accelerationist arguments and basis for an anti-politics that at the time I felt was utterly repugnant. However, despite my original distaste, libidinal economy as a concept remained with me, particularly after my encounter with Black critical theory after 2009. I'm thinking, of course, of Jared Sexton's use of the concept in amalgamation schemes and Frank Wilderson's definition, a citation of Sexton, in Red, White, and Black. The concept bothered me so much, it demanded I ask questions about it that I felt were either unsatisfactorily answered in Leotard, or, as in the case of the Black slave, which is the focus of my work, neglected entirely. While, of course, there was mention of slavery in the case of the industrial slave or prostitute in an unfolding of Klosowski's Living Currency, the Black slave under racial slavery was not the concern. Rather, the concern was about the use of women as a site of value production and price differential closer to the work of Leopoldina Fortunati in The Arcane of Reproduction. I was and remain curious about the Black slave. Not the industrial slave, not the faceless prostitute, but the Black slave whose predicament is as the symbol of slaveness with neither analogy or nor alibi of ancient slavery. There was, in my contending with Black critical theory, a realignment of how I understood libidinal economy, infused with the thinking of Sexton and Wilderson, among others, toward it being distribution and arrangement of identification and desire, and some of us will recognize those exact terms, right? Libidinal economy, for me, is a speculative unity with political economy. And it's not simply collapsible or reducible to it. Further, it's my contention that the unity that political and libidinal economy means, the unity that political and libidinal economy, what that means is that we can not only find homologous structures between economies, and that political economy is a playing out of desire and aggression, but that libidinal economy contains shapes that are constructed in the image of political economic modes and concepts. Sorry, I'm struggling with allergies. Santa Ana's blew into Los Angeles yesterday, and I'm not doing great, guys. Sorry. So I will probably use the cup as emotional support, so I don't sniff too much. Sorry. So we find those structures, the isomorphic structures and modes across both political and libidinal economy. And finally, these are best discerned through the Black slave, which is the central node in this unity. So today, I'm working to unfurl one of these concepts, the derivative as money and as the Black slave. So as so many things happen, I was reminded to revisit Gail Jones's Corregidora by a post on Twitter. I hadn't read it since undergrad and had lost my dog-eared copy. I remembered loving it, being devastated by it, taking in every word on the page about Great Graham and Ursa and Tadpole and Mutt, and making generations and taken wombs. At least I thought I had taken in every word. What I missed in that first reading, and what was missed in Christina Sharp's masterful reading in Monstrous Intimacies, is the little passage that comes early in an italicized memory. And it's in this passage, which I'll read in full, which stands as the core of this admittedly preliminary inquiry that I'm doing today. So the quote: "A Portuguese seaman turned plantation owner. He took her out of the field when she was still a child and put her to work in his whorehouse. She was to go out or he would bring the men in, and the money they gave her was to turn over to him. There were other women he used like that. She was the pretty one with the almond eyes and the coffee bean skin. His favorite. A good little piece, my best. Dorita, little gold piece." That's the quote. Dorita, little gold piece, stands out. With a diminutive that has a meaning that evokes gift from God or bountiful, Great Graham is linked immediately, and I found my attention held. Great Graham, the slave child of the eponymous Corregidora, bringing in more than her own value, is equated to a money, and he calls her this more than once. In fact, at a certain point, he ends up calling her my little gold pussy. And I asked myself, why has this passage, this nickname, been so neglected? Corregidora tells us that Great Graham, and ostensibly those generations she made more than herself, is a little gold piece. Jones telegraphing to us that the slave child is not a commodity, but is instead money. Money is a fraught concept, even in its widely accepted definitions. Means of payment, unit of account, medium of exchange. The usual definitions beg the question, offering at best a functionalist account of this strange, ubiquitous thing that seems to move between us, apparently guiding us toward our ends. And this is the aspect of the novel that gets neglected. With Great Graham as this little gold piece, the slave child who instructs her progeny to make generations, Ursa's removed uterus is in tension with this now impossible intergenerational demand. She can no longer make more. And it's right here that readers of Corregidora tend to get caught, right? The question of making generations, of the sexual violence of slavery, the contentious motherhood and subjectivity produced in the break. These are great places to get caught. But why do the names of Great Graham get lost in such analyses? If Great Graham is a gift from God, bountiful, the little gold piece, might this suggest something critical about the structure of slavery? And it's my contention that it does, that its significance suggests a means to understand the structure of racial slavery without labor and without the commodification of the person. Today, I'm going to talk about the significance of the little gold piece for grasping the structure of racial slavery along two lines. First, I'll argue the slave stands far closer to money and thus closer to a derivative than any industrial commodity like cotton or tobacco. Secondly, I'll use the slave as money to unfold Suhail Malik's concept of the arche derivative from the ontology of finance, which he defines as the, quote, a priori of political economy. As to the stakes of this little meander, We ultimately will fail to grasp two things if we continue to neglect what's going on in Jones's book, but also what it tells us about the structure of slavery. First, the significance of the intervention that Frantz Fanon has leveled and Marriott has unfolded, namely that Blackness is the site of difference within the category of difference itself. And secondly, and relatedly, by missing that significance, we critically misunderstand the imbrication of political economy and libidinal economy around the Black, at the risk of incorrectly identifying the necessary struts for dismantling the world. So, when we first meet Dorita, the little gold piece who ages into Great Graham, and the remembering Ursa says her palms are like sunburnt gold, we're immediately brought into awareness of what this child slave is to her owner. By taking her out of the field and putting her to work in his brothel, her slaveness is severed, seemingly, from the production of a commodity. While she takes part in the sexual labor and so the production of the whorehouse, when brought to contend with her name's diminutive and the inheritable demand to make generations, the labor aspect is exposed as an important but inessential aspect of the structure of racial slavery. So to do away with this error in hewing to a labor theory of slavery, I want to pause on the other way that Great Graham is described in that passage, her coffee bean skin. Aside from the signaling of her dark skin tone, relevant to the ever lighter skin of those made generations, we have the king commodity in Brazil, where Corregedora's plantation was located. This metaphor of her skin as the color of coffee, taken in the most straightforward way, is to tie commodity production to the slave and seems to say that she, by being the color of a commodity, was a commodity. But taking this a step further, and with the demand to make generations, to make more of herself who can serve as evidence and deliver the verdict, which comes later in the novel, we're not quite talking about Great Graham being a simple commodity. Her replicability, through her being the pretty one, his favorite, the one with whom he fathered at least Graham and Ursa's mother, potentially Ursa as well, suggests we're in the world of increase, of slave breeding for the purpose of generational stability, which is to say, as slaves and as bearers of witness to its evil. Great Graham, the little gold piece, the gift from God that gives bountifully, signals this sort of tension between the money and the commodity. And instead, to call her coffee bean is to signal actually what she begets, which is more slaves, difference. While Graham's flesh is the color of one of the commodities that the Corregidora plantation produces, the other being sex, we should understand this as indicating the key metonymic function of money, in that it begets difference through the exchange for commodities, which in turn, and in the case of capitalization, begets more money. When Jones tells us that Great Graham is the color of the commodity, alongside the pet names, what is being evoked is the difference begetting function of money and its interaction with commodity production, not that Great Graham is a simple commodity among a host of others. And this is what is being illustrated without being explicitly said about the structure of slavery, namely that the slave is more akin to money than she is to a commodity. Even her commodityness is about the fact that she, as the little gold piece with coffee-colored skin, brings in more of herself metonymically. In her making generations, in her bearing Corregidora's children and her and Graham's ongoing demand to make generations to be evidence, what appears as her commodityness instead reveals a moneyness that is concealed if we stay at the surface of her skin while neglecting the rest that makes up Great Graham and her generations. So I bring up this metonymic function of money, which I'm taking from Colin Drum and his amazing dissertation. I bring up this metonymic function in order to underscore what stands as the first half of the argument. The Black slave, as Jones is indicating, is a being for exchange. Her purpose in the plantation system is not, as is so often thought to be the case, as commodity or producer of commodities. In the case of the former, the fact of her purchase and sale is, if anything, closer to being the purchase of a bond or debt instrument, as I've sort of argued in a different place. In the case of the latter, the fact of the production of commodities, coffee or sex, it's inessential to her function as slave. Her function is to beget difference, whether in the bringing of men into the brothel, making generations whose purpose is to make generations, to be available for collateral, debt settling, securitization, as we have lots of evidence of that being what slaves were used for. The slave, rather than being marked by what Christopher Arthur has called the spectral ontology of value, in the abstracted and absented use value of the quantity, is marked by a structural indebtedness accompanied by an absolute dereliction in the duty to amortize and repay. The slave is money in that she begets more of herself, not as producer, and not begetting simply the same thing, but by being that piece, that asset in a metonymic chain of difference that is founded upon a necessary and necessarily internal difference. So, give me a second with the allergies, emotional support. Okay, to get at the internal difference, which will take me on to the second track of the paper, around the arcade derivative, we need to establish not so much that derivatives are a form of money, pace Edward LaPuma and Bryan and Rafferty in Capitalism with Derivatives, or the social life derivatives in the case of LaPuma. We need to reverse their claim to say rather that money is a form of derivative. According to Bryan and Rafferty, the ascendance and dominance of financial derivatives since the 1970s has made derivatives into a form of money because of their capacity to bind and blend. Derivatives bind the future to the present and the present to the future through the pricing process, and blend capitals and asset forms into a single measurable class of assets, pricing apparently nebulous ideas as well, like the weather or political instability, into tradable entities. Through this process of binding and blending, the derivative functions as a money in and of itself. But to claim that money is a derivative and that derivatives are the logical a priori of money, we need first to have a grasp on what a derivative really is. Contained in and constituting the derivative is what Suhail Malik has through an engagement with Derrida's différance, is differential pricing. It's differential. Don't make me do it. I've left Canada. I can't do the accent anymore. He tells us that the price differential operates according to the logic of temporization. He continues, and this is Malik, the quote, the delivery or exercise price is the price as the contract is drawn up, and without the non-coincidence, emphasis his, of the delivery price with the strike price, there could be no derivative, end quote. And it's here that the logic of différance is at play. The derivative is constituted by an interval, a split in what it is and what it is not. It's not so much that the derivative is secondary to pricing in the so-called real economy, but that it, quote, instantiates an intervallic differentiation characteristic of différance in terms of price, end quote, exposing the structural contingency that constitutes the derivative's contract in the first instance. What the derivative's contract sets out is a time horizon containing a time in which the interval opened is due to close, an open option in which the future is linked to the present, and the constitutive contingency between actual price and inactuality at its exercise or expiration. The absolute futurity of this intrinsic contingency is for Malik the logical a priori of the derivative's contract through this open and deferred interval that is instituted by the contracting of the derivative underlies optionality, in that it could always have been other than what it was until the point of expiration or valuation, which is the, quote, completion, exhaustion, or conclusion of the pricing process, end quote. Internal to the derivative and the way that it temporizes is the necessary end of the term, which sets out and structures the contingent option interval and the derivative that the derivative contract opens. I am so sorry. I know derivatives. It's a lot. Money in being the difference that begets difference through absolute liquidity, which is also priced, can be understood as a derivative through différance and differential pricing. First, to hold money means to hold the option open that it represents, not only in the pricing process of the liquidity premium or option operations of competing comparable currencies, but in that, as Michel Adlietta tells us, that money is a cardinal symbol of belief in the future of its acceptance, such that it binds the present to the future. In being itself an option, which is to say it offers the right but not the obligation to exchange for anything else, money opens and defers an interval wherein it can always be other than what it is, containing the time horizon of its being exercised, the closing of the option. The time horizon contained in money as option that links it in the present to the future is twofold. First, through the capacity to close it out by letting it beget the difference that its liquidity entails. Second, through the belief that it will be accepted in the future. The temporizing nature of money itself is contained in its own structural difference. It produces a present with a split future in which there is one actual future through the act of exchange and those that remain inactual. So if I have $2 and I go to spend $1.97 on my Diet Coke, as I do every morning, the option that the money represents, its internal contingency closes out when I metonymically use it to exchange for the other thing, the Diet Coke in this case. So as its contingency closes out, the one who held $1.79, me, that money has reached its point of exhaustion for me. Its optionality has collapsed into choice. By holding money, I hold the liquid contingency that it represents, a piece of the collective, according to Michel Aglietta, and the capacity for a given thing to be or not to be. So I'm going to go a little further in order to return to Derrida, the little gold piece. Money as a derivative contains and is constituted by a further split that crafts the social field around it. There is a part of this differential interval that asks what money is for. Is it for stabilizing kin relations through the chains of inheritance and disinheritance, or is it for exchange, the practices of buying and selling? The option that money represents, its derivativeness, is between these two beings of money. It represents the option to take either of these routes. Until the one who holds it exercises the option, the term lies open, the right to either and the optional contingency latent in liquidity active. And we see this in Great Graham as Derrida and the way she is conceived of by Jones through the character of Corregidora. Derrida is an open option. She can be moved to the field and into the brothel as part of the cycle of production, while at the same time she can and does, making generations, make or break a chain of inheritance while remaining for exchange. Not only do we see her in this, not only do we see this in her demand on her descending kin, but also in the way she's used by Corregidora, solidifying his relation with his wife, and through her being forced to fuck them both. Derrida's violation at the hands of both Mr. and Mrs., Master and Mistress Corregidora, who would not or could not fuck each other, is the stabilizing force in the Corregidora line of inheritance. She paradoxically consummates their marriage while standing as pure disinheritance, only evidence of her being this open option. She is this internal divide, being for exchange as owned whore, and that which stabilizes a line of kin relation that is not her own. Even after the abolition of slavery in Brazil and all the papers were burned, this line of maid generations, and it's important, this is not the women, Great Graham versus Mother and Ursa, this is not a kin line. They live on as evidence of the little gold piece who could be moved anywhere, because in being but not having the option, her blackness, qua moneyness, the differential interval of the open term, ensured that what could be done with her was never collapsed into pure choice nor exhausted by valuation. She stayed firmly liquid, granting in her status as slave the optionality qua freedom to her master, Corregidora. The slave grants the deferral of the tyranny of choice. She can be prostitute, she can be collateral, she can be labor, she can be wet nurse, she can be evidence, but it is not required that she be any, because she is all or represents all, the option for all. She holds open and defers the having to choose by the master, the point at which the option she represents would collapse. In being anything, in being marked by blackness, that symbolized option that emerges out of the plantation and persists beyond emancipation, the slave stands for liquidity in the libidinal economy. Blackness, racial blackness, subtended by this symbolic made material liquidity through which anything can be attained, is the most liquid symbol. And her owner, quote, buys the freedom to decide otherwise, starting from the decision taken, end quote, at the point of her purchase. Through the slave, the slaveness comes prior. This internal both and, the contingency of the option, this difference in the category of difference that the blackness of slaveness represents, is the plantation derivation. What is both unleashed by the fact of the Black slave and what structures the blackness that emerges out of slaveness. One of the critical ways that implies blackness as slaveness is monetary is the way that those who have and hold blackness hold it as this open option. Due to its liquidity, absolute liquidity, because it is a life debt, wherein the non-Black can stand in for the absolute creditor, death, pace Michelle Aglietta, the metonymic capacity of blackness to attain anything without collapsing into choice. That's what we get. At the moment of enslavement by conception or capture, a debt accompanied by an absolute dereliction in the capacity to pay is opened. The captor, by maintaining the physical life of the captive, stands in the place of debt, and the debt term this capture engenders is a deferral that opens space for the optionness, the moneyness that binds the present to the future through the term, and the belief in its future acceptance, while at the same time instituting the difference begetting function. It's another way of saying that the open option that blackness qua slaveness and moneyness represents by these internal and endogenous differentials, price differentials between strike and delivery, the time horizon engendered by the fact of the option, the intervallic deferral, subtends the absolute liquidity that begets difference. This endogenous difference in the category difference, the differential that is blackness, is logically prior to the slave, even if chronologically following. This differential blackness is its ontology. It is the internal endogenous difference that in Fanonian parlance is the gap between the Negro myth and the fact of blackness, the that within where the ne-pa reigns for David Marriott. Considering the main action of Corregidora, I felt I had to talk about it because so much of the novel takes place in Ursa's present, right? The post-emancipation question interrupts and the moneyness of blackness kind of loomed up again. In being evidence of a crime, of evil, the Corregidor women aim to stand as part of a charge, conviction, and condemnation of their owner-father violator of the plantation and of the structure of slavery writ large. What I want to draw our attention to here is that in the Corregidor lineage of women, they're not subjects of even a metaphorical legal process, right? They're not to be in the subject position plaintiff in the adjudication of a crime, but are rather explicitly objects of a legal process. Further, if we can accept that the legal process demonstrates that the human person, being a juridical entity, is its ultimate value, and crucially, that it is in the juridical process that the citizen subject stands a chance of enforcing the social contract, with all of these things adjudicated either through money or time in the case of damages or prison. And by creating and offering up these made generations as evidence, post-emancipation assumes and negates important aspects of what I've been talking about. It articulates that the begotten Corregidora line of women retains the slave's object status between 1888, which is emancipation, abolition in Brazil. And this is a recognition that they themselves are not signatories to any social contract, but are instead aspects of the contract that is signed, enforced, adjudicated, and executed by what is recognized as the subject of law and constitutional order. They are evidence. They can be evidence. Specifically, evidence not only of the crime, but also that even beyond slavery, they are for the begetting of something else, for the enjoyment of something else. In this case, they're for the movement of what appears as the highest sovereign authority in the court toward legitimate justice that they themselves cannot enjoy. Emancipation, as illustrated by the corregidor lineage, rather than a break through which the slave becomes a citizen person, it's a rolling over of the position that is held by the social field that is non-Black, rather than, that is non-Black, and marks another deferral. But now the owner, father, violator is not the singular master. The master is the social field in its entirety. The moneyness of slaveness, all the little gold pieces, reveals that this différance, the interval that is opened, offers a means to unravel Malik's arcade derivative. So I'm coming to that second piece now, and then I'm done. So Malik defines the arcade derivative as the, quote, primacy and priority for price as such, and, quote, the a priori of political economy constituted by the ontology of price, end quote. So if we understand money as an option, it is what structures Malik's arcade derivative. The concealed derivative, real or symbolic, which reveals that derivatives are the ground of moneyness, i.e. the difference, the différance that begets difference. Thus, the ontology of price is subtended by moneyness as the arcade derivative, the means through which price is expressed. It's writing. From here, Blackness qua slavery, which, as I've argued, has the structure of moneyness, then offers us a means to discern what Malik neglects when it comes to the concept, namely the gift. The split future of the option with the time horizon its expiration represents as internal to it, while simultaneously requiring the position that it will be accepted in the future, is the giving of time. It's the gift itself. The begetting of difference via absolute liquidity is subtended by the endogenous and internal difference that founds Blackness, like moneyness. The begetting of difference can be understood as the economic circle of exchange, with its kernel of madness, the gift, at its center. Malik never quite squares that circle in his article, despite the Derridian engagement. So Blackness, by giving time, is the libidinal economy's arcade derivative, that primary and logical ground of the process of enslavement, through which the option is opened. The es gift of the gift, the giving, which must be forgotten, and one mustn't forget to forget, is the binding action of the derivative, and Blackness, in its giving time via the operations of slavery, defers the choice, the valuation, the exhaustion of the process by which it emerges is what can be forgotten, what must be forgotten. The pricing process that Malik contends is the operation of the derivative does in fact give time, as it is necessarily forgotten, it's concealed, and it's the movement of the impossible gift. I want to push Malik's concept further by drawing it closer to Derrida's. Malik, and this is, to be fair, this is where I'm literally in the process of building what's happening in this, whatever this will be, okay? So Malik explicitly notes that he takes the concept of arcade derivative from Derrida's arcade writing. Being the logical a priori of speech, arcade writing is at the origin of sense, the non-presence that cannot be reduced to the form of presence. While it may be without a historical locus, and writing itself may in fact be historically posterior to speech, arcade writing is the logical and structural precondition. It's a trace. My contention is that for Malik's arcade derivative to actually work, the pricing process and valuation has to be understood alongside a writing, an inscription. The move toward the collapse of optionality engendered in the moment of valuation, assuming, of course, there's no rolling over of the position, is a moment of writing. And for the arcade derivative as arcade writing to work, money stands forth as in the position of la langue in the Lacanian sense for political economy, as the functioning of the system of signs through which we attempt to discern the movements of the economy. It is further why there's a crowding out of money within this system of signifiers, economics, because it's the logical precondition. It's not an object of any language. Money is the form of inscription of the pricing process, the arcade derivative's arcade, if you will, the site and structure of its operations, and the privileged but necessarily concealed sign through which the pricing process is made possible, intelligible, and shareable. The practice of accounting conceals that, as Philip Goodchild writes, quote, money has no present being. Money only exists in memory or anticipation as a record in account books, end quote. Money is the language of the account, the arche writing of political economy itself. And it is itself a derivative, revealing that the arche derivative, if it is anything, is arche writing, the différance at the core of moneyness. And so, to bring it back to our little gold piece, to Dorita, because she illuminates this understanding of Blackness as option, as derivative. For money to have no present being la langue of political economy, the mode in which the pricing process is rendered intelligible and shared, the open option, that is absolute liquidity, and Blackness having a structural homology with money, Blackness qua slaveness would have to occupy this non-position in the libidinal economy. Maybe we've heard things about non-positions in libidinal economies before when we're talking about Blackness. I've argued that Jones suggests this role for Great Graham, but what if this problem of the originary writing, after revealing the arche derivative of money, which is the arche writing of political economy, the trace of this structural necessity, logical a priori, and the fact of language itself, what if Blackness is a marker and cardinal symbol through which the libidinal economy, its desires and aggressions are written, occupying a position both fundamental to and outside the discourse of libidinal economy? In the same way that the economist can't quite discuss money and the drive toward accumulation of money itself sets out the means and mode through which the derivative writes itself, Blackness is the logical a priori of libidinal economy constructed around slaveness that at the same time cannot enter the conversation except at the same kind of parallax. As the site of drive and desire, including the drive to destroy and the desire to keep, Blackness is the mode through which slavery becomes possible, intelligible, and shareable. It is how sentient beings are made eligible for slavery, the writing of how they're made eligible for slavery, how the slave is written before the language of Blackness takes the form as the Negro. Blackness, then, is the la langue through which the libidinal economy, as the organization of distribution of sign.
Are we okay?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so it's time for questions and comments.
All right, see you all later, bye.
I think I saw maybe Colin had raised his hand on there, but I'm not certain.
But Leia did.
Yeah,
I think Leia just used a react.
Yeah.
Hi all, you should be able to unmute yourselves and ask questions as needed.
Oh, wait. It was disabled for a moment. That's why. Okay, great.
Wow.
Sorry, am I supposed to speak now? Have I been called on? Thanks, Taija. It was great to hear this talk a little slower, so I could follow it. So my question is, you're thinking about Blackness as something that is written. Wait, am I saying something funny?
You did copy for a second, but Blackness,
oh, I see.
That is written. Please continue.
Yeah, so you mentioned at the end of your talk, Blackness is something that is written as a consequence of the failure to roll over, right? So you presented an alternative of something that is either rolled over or written, and Blackness is that which is written. So when we're thinking about this, we're now brushing up against the problem of inside versus outside money and horizontal and vertical structures in the system. So there's a question of what some economists call demand for real balances. It's a question that Marx kind of stumbles through in volume 2 and invents all kinds of torturous arguments in order to try to figure out how much money is needed by the economy. And this is a problem because often money isn't needed. Where balances can be netted out, you can have extraordinarily large amounts of nominal funding that is accomplished without very much money at all. And this is what happens in the medieval trade fairs and this kind of thing. So there's this question about how much money is needed. And what none of the economic writers quite grasp is that the amount of money that's needed relative to the amount of notional funding in the economy is an index of the asymmetry of credit relations. So there's not just a bathtub of money, the quantity theory. Instead, there's what mathematicians would call a graph. So the economy is a payments graph, and the graph has more or less asymmetry. So in a perfectly symmetrical payments graph, there would not be any need for money. We could net everything out, right? So money, demand for money, for real balances is an index of the asymmetry in the payments graph. So my question is, so obviously I'm sold on much of the moves that you're making. My question is, if we're going to extend this argument, how do we think about this inside versus outside distinction? And try to get rigorous about that. So that's my question. I hope I came across clearly.
You did right up until you asked the question itself.
Oh, okay. So my question is just, if we're going to extend this analogy, where does this inside versus outside distinction? How are they related to one another? So how is the reproduction of insideness generate a need for outsideness as a result of its failure to make itself symmetrical? Do you see? And if given that blackness, social death is a kind of outsideness, how do we begin to relate these concepts? That's my question. So my question is just, how can we take the next step in thinking about this?
I wish I could tell you like instinctually how we actually go about taking that next step. Like it is literally the next step. The point I don't have yet. Do you know what I mean? Like it's like it's the next thing. So.
Well, we're gonna have to keep thinking about this then.
Well, exactly. This is that's I guess I'll pontificate for a second. It is I think the fact that this question can be asked and that it looks as though there is a way to extend it is, I think, why all the work that's being done around this question of moneyness and slaves and blackness is working. It's generating exactly the kind of question that if we, even instinctually as we look at it, we go, oh, there really could be something there. Oh shit. You get the next trajectory. So all of that to really say, I don't know yet. And I look forward to working on that next step.
Okay, I question and a comment. I understand, or correct me if I misunderstand, that by moving away from the labor-slave theory, you gain something in terms of a perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think in your presentation, you showed us what you can gain. Let me ask you, okay, do you lose something? Question mark. Because I will say, Marx would have said that what makes the system, the capitalist system, unstable is basically the tension between commodities or wage labor or whatever, and this is the important thing, is and the concreteness of what he called the lebendige Leiblichkeit, the living bodies of these workers. And he also calls these living bodies kind of, or he says this is the reason why we have to call workers a very specific commodities, because they are alive and they have a body and they can resist, they struggle, they don't want to be exploited. So there is the kind of a place in which you can locate struggle and instability is a conflict of temporalities. Abstract temporality on the one hand, and the concrete temporality of your life and bodies. And so my question is there a place for this historical dimension in your reconstruction? Is there a place for these concrete histories of struggle and resistance from, I don't know, Robin Kelly and George Rowick and these kind of histories, or even more, or Marie Boutin as slavery as a form of immobilization. You have to make these people incapable. You have to create a possibility for these people to go away, to walk away. So, and again, it's about what you do with these bodies. And then a very short related question is, again, I think moving away from the labor slave theory, again, I think I need to think more about that, but I can see that you gain something. I understand that the kind of a dominant form of a temporalization of time is a temporalization from the future in a certain way. Again, my question is, what about the concreteness of a temporalization from the past that is related to the body again? You know, there are bodies which carry traditions, habits, cultures. And then at a certain point, there is a conflict between these two dimensions. So basically, my question is, what is the place where you would place all these kind of things, if they are useful for your understanding of slavery?
Right. So, like, your first question is, do you think I lose something by rejecting like the labor theory of slavery? And my rejection of it is that, like, labor is like, as I say, it's important, but it's ultimately inessential to understanding the structure of racial slavery. It's not that slaves didn't labor, they did, we know they did, but instead that to understand the position slave and thus the position Black, you can't do that through labor. It doesn't work. It's like this site of analogy with workers that allows for like the wage slave problem. And it makes Blackness disappear in order to pose that analogy. So my rejection of the labor theory of slavery is just that, simply like the position of the slave just can't be understood through labor alone. And then in terms of like the concrete histories of resistance and struggle, and I have a vast respect for that historical work, but I take really, really seriously what natal alienation means. When you make a slave, again, by conception or capture, the method of recruitment doesn't matter. They are, yes, of course, they carry memories of all kinds of things, but they are utterly and completely severed from that heritage. And in being severed from that heritage, it becomes important but inessential to understanding maybe the trajectory towards abolition. Like, I don't believe there is an essential Africanity that, I mean, exists in Africa alone, but like exists across the Middle Passage, across the auction block, onto the plantation. And thus I will learn about a trajectory of struggle toward abolition, toward ending the world through this Africanity. I just don't buy it. I think the severance of natal alienation, which I take the social death thesis really seriously. I think the severance of natal alienation is fundamentally what makes the slave, what makes Blackness, and you can't get around it by pointing to like histories of resistance and struggle, as much as they're there. And in that I take Hartman very seriously, in that all of that resistance, all of that struggle ultimately is part of the reproduction of slavery itself. It is not only like a means of off-gassing the stresses of the plantation system, but it is ultimately another site of enjoyment and another site of claiming for the non-Black social field. So they don't really fit into my argument and my work, because I don't think they're essential to the actual structure and conceptual problem I'm getting at. Does that answer the question?
Hi, thanks so much for this. You stitched together a series of literatures that I have like uneven familiarity with.
Me too.
Okay. Way too more than me in several cases. So I don't know if this question sort of hits up like the wrong level of abstraction or something like that. But I was fascinated to like listen and then like imagine consequences of your intervention that, as we're saying, that to understand slavery or the slave as money, quite derivative, rather than as labor, commodity, etc. Like a key part of this was, of course, the optionality that one has when they possess a slave, across presumably the length of their lifetime, their bodily life, etc. And then one of those key options, particularly from the reading of the novel that we got, was the option to generate more slaves. So I just wondered whether there was like whether there's a different position or like some sort of specificity for a male slave, within this like matrix, I guess, because I guess at least in some cases the male slave is not essential to producing the next generation of slaves, or whether that's just not at all. It also made me think. I guess this is maybe more of a comment, but it made me think of these other works about the abortions, resistance to birthing child by female slaves that also sound pretty like newly you kind of sound in a new way on the basis of your work, I think, than is usually understood.
Thanks for the question. So so this is part of where the work is like, on the one hand, it's headed towards what Colin brought out in terms of like how I'm theorizing, like money and political economy and finance and so on. That's like one trajectory, and then the other trajectory is there's a second novel I'm hoping to bring in. That while it doesn't deal with the sort of male side of reproduction in terms of slavery, it is sort of most of the characters are men, and I'm gonna just leave it right there because I haven't done the work and I don't want to say something wild. So first of all, like the male slave as ultimately and fundamentally different from the female slave is just like, it's not where I'm gonna ever go. Be that because I'm talking about like ungendering and fungibility in terms of Black, because I'm talking about Blackness. That's one thing. And then, there was also forced breeding of male and female slaves together, right? It wasn't solely, the violation of white masters. There's also cases of forced breeding. That's another thing. And then from there, the question of male slaves kind of bumps up against the problem of partus sequitur ventrum. Partus, right? So if the child is following the mother, that's the sort of line of disinheritance. That's going to have to sort of be where the focus kind of stands. But because the slave is not genderless, but is is a mass, you know, it's a bunch rather than individuals. It's something to consider in light of Partis, with Partis still standing as like that central thing. And, you know, in the case of McDougall, it's a line of women that do stabilize, you know, a masculine mastering line, and then go on to sort of stabilize the social field, which is patriarchal. So I'm not taking it super intensely, but there is a line where I will go in that direction with it.
Oh, so what is this at the moment?
It's a secret.
Oh, wow.
I just don't want to say anything about it because I've again, it's one of the ones I've read, you know, a few years ago, and I don't want to say it's this and then make a claim and then be like, oh, that was in a different book, wasn't it?
Right.
I just don't want to do that. So
That's very smart.
just, you know, play something close to the chest.
We have a question online.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so I don't really know what I'm asking yet, but it kind of goes off what Max was talking about. First of all, it was great talk. I think it goes off, you said you take seriously natal alienation. Okay, so for Derrida to be is to inherit.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's cut off, so this kind of connects with Afro-pessimist literature in terms of the non-being of the Black, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it also seems that you're linking it in with Derrida's notion of trace, which is precisely presence, non-presence, and non-absence, which is not really not being. So I'm just trying to see how that connects. And then you get all these notions of stamp, mark, and they link to the trace. But so are you saying that once it's a new mark so that the history's gone here, and this new notion of being after the mark or after the stamp is the basis or foundation that is needed or necessary for the economy to function, and for is this what I'm trying to figure out exactly what you're saying is I guess the question, and how it links to Derrida.
Sure. Okay, so you cut out really, really, really badly through a part of that. So I can only the only part I heard really clearly was the question of natal alienation, to be as to inherit, and then the trace. That was where it started. Sorry, that's what we got. That's what I got. And then you went where exactly? Or do you want me to just address that?
You're muted.
Yeah, you are muted.
Emmett, you're muted. Emmett, you're muted.
Yeah, so I don't have the power to unmute myself, so I have to wait for the unmute. Yeah, so that sucks that I was because I'm trying to formulate my question and I'm talking, which is just how I do things, which causes problems for me and for other people. But the notion of, I'm trying to link this into Derrida's understanding, and it seems to be that you're drawing on his work, not only in the notion of the trace, but also in the notion of the gift. Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to see, is the mark or the stamp here, is that the first act kind of thing? So I'm breaking up all over the place. So you could just skip my question. But anyway, how does this connect to Derrida is basically it.
I'm really sorry, Emmett. Once again, as you went to ask the question, it cut out. Would you mind putting it in the chat? Is that possible? Because I would like to. No, you can't. Oh boy. Oh dear. So I'm getting like everything up to where you're actually asking me what you want me to answer. I can say something about like natal alienation, to be, to inherit, and the trace and the gift. I can sort of roughly say something. I hope maybe by chance this will answer some of what you've asked. I'll do my best. Okay, so Yes, I am drawing, of course, on Derrida. And part of what I'm drawing on from Derrida is, of course, like RK writing, absolutely, and for RK derivative, which is through Malik, but also the question and problem of the gift, which Derrida, the setting out of a term, it gives as a being non-being, a thing that's not a thing, the madness at the circle in the middle of the economic circle that sets it off, but has to be completely forgotten in order for it to turn, the circle to turn. And so that's really where it comes from a question of, all of this comes from a question of whether we should call Blackness a gift, right? Whether we should say that Blackness is a gift to the world. At the same time is fundamental to the functioning of not solely the political economy, but also the symbolic economy, the libidinal economy, right? That has to be there, but has to also be annulled, right? And has to be forgotten. So this is where this really derives from, is like, okay, if natal alienation is the central thing, this pure disin.
Oh. Yep. People are coming back. Yeah.
Emmett's in the middle of his question.
No, I think Emma's question is not.
I think it's bad luck, actually.
Yeah.
He's not allowed. Sorry, Emmett.
Okay. Can you hear us?
I think they are stuck.
Yeah.
Frozen. Yeah. Okay. Bob and Steve.
No, it's okay.
Okay,
Oh, no, yeah. They're coming back. Yeah.
people are coming back, right?
Some will come back.
Okay, some of them are back anyway. So having your dissertation, I want to try to zoom out a little bit on your answer to Max's question. You said that you're rejecting the Blackness explanation of slavery.
The labor explanation.
Yeah. And but also that what characterizes the Blackness explanation of slavery. Having read your dissertation, you're also rejecting the slavery explanation of Blackness. That is to say, the ways in which Blackness is considered denigrating because it's associated with a slave status.
Right. So
what I really want to do is to ask you to zoom out a little bit and specify structurally what the role of Blackness is, and what provoked me to ask the question is the association with Derrida, and particularly the question of whether the Blackness of slavery is what allowed capital to accumulate.
Right.
That seems to be, which is to suggest that what was most brilliant in your thesis really was the way in which you showed how the abolition of slavery leads Blackness and the financial system, the system of capital accumulation, as its remainder. That's as fundamental an argument about the history of capitalism as can be seen in the various arguments that the renting out of slave labor as something that was collateralizable in the South is fundamental in John Levy's your work to the history of wage labor in general. That is to say that this is the rental price of slaves. Now, what I want you to do in relation to sort of situating, you know, what was brilliant about the dissertation into today's presentation is to talk about the specific state to Blackness as something that connects to the difference between this. Is it Blackness that makes slaves collateral in addition to being commodities? And is it the spread between, is the idea that you can finance plantation production by collateralizing your slaves without selling them based on the spread between their purchase price and how much you can borrow against them? Is this the kind of mechanism that you think is enabled by the Blackness of slavery and that would not have been possible, for example, in the case of white indentured labor or the captive native conscripted corvée of captive indigenous? Is it the idea that you can finance production in the plantation by collateralizing your labor force? Is this what you are saying about the Blackness of slavery? And if so, is it an accident or is it fundamental to the Blackness of slavery? And thus the financial system that enables the expansion of wage labor outside the plantation economy was in fact facilitated by the plantation economy and by the fact that the labor force in the plantation economy was collateralizable before you could borrow against machinery in the industrial economy, for example.
Okay, so there is on the one hand, like, yeah, that is kind of what I'm saying, but I'm not saying that, like, again, like for me, this is not solely a question of the of political economy at all. It's that the slave occupied that sort of spot, if we can call it that, in political economy. They could be barred against. They could be anything, right? They were liquid in that way. They could be anything, whether that is they were just kept. They could be destroyed. They could whatever. I'm not willing to make a direct claim because I don't have for this specific thing. I don't have empirical evidence that it was in a certain way a kind of accident. It became retrospective because I don't have any empirical evidence to make that claim that it was delivered in that way, right? But Blackness, sort of at the point of emancipation, becomes the thing that was fundamental to the ability to collateralize slaves as a whether that was an explanation or it was actually fundamental to that position in the libidinal economy where the slave the black stops being this thing in this collateralizable thing in political economy, and at the point of emancipation that moves into the libidinal economy. Not solely, never solely, but is at least, at the very least, retrospectively made to appear absolutely fundamental to Blackness, or to slaveness. Sorry, that this position that was like the slave is now the Black. That Black, I believe, and I've seen some of this, is like the logical necessity to slaveness, to this expansive position that can be anything, whether that is collateral, whether that is a whore, whether that is a nothing. So, like, to answer the question what Blackness is like, it requires a sort of answer of it has no positive content. It is nothing, and in a certain way, because it is everything, and for that it is nothing. It can be used for anything except it.
That's what we needed to bring it back.
It's still there.
Apparently, if this helps anything, I just heard there was a small earthquake that happened somewhere in the state. So.
I just want to send a question if you want that from Zoom also.
I do have a question. This might be generative, it might go nowhere, so we'll see. I was wondering about the specificity of the metaphor of gold. The slave master, who I think is the one who calls this character little gold piece. He doesn't say diamond, he doesn't say silver, he doesn't say cash box, he doesn't say cash. And I'm wondering whether the specificity of gold matters to your argument about derivatives. I wonder whether it matters to your argument about liquidity. So I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
I think in sort of conjunction working with Colin, it is going to ultimately matter, yes, very much, that it's gold. But stop laughing, Colin. I can feel it. I don't even have to hear it. I think it's going to matter, but at this precise moment, it's just it's a hint at where I needed to go, where I was trying to go. There is also, through a bunch of literature, not even comparing, calling slaves gold and calling slaves not just using them as sort of forms of money, but actually referring to them as gold. And then, we get a lot of the obfuscating arguments, oh, they're talking about Roman slaves, And it's like, okay, sure. But then there's a certain point where that stops working, that they're talking about like slaves in Roman and Greek antiquity. And the gold problem starts to appear again and again in the literature, as like the way that slaves are referred to, Black slaves in particular. So like, yes, it matters, but it was simply an indication of where I was going, not like a fundamental thing, because I'm not really dealing with coinage quite yet. But then again, we did have a character who turned up, I have a picture of it actually, a character who turned up called Ben Franklin in Zoom. And there is this very strange satirical piece that we think was written by Ben Franklin called The New Black Flesh Coin. And it's about using slaves as coins, fingers, drawing their toes, drawing their legs to use as counts of money. And so, like, yes, it matters. Absolutely, like that's gold, but it's, I'm not making like a historical argument, I'm making conceptual argument. Right. So it's in the ether, let's say it like that.
Right. Well, it seems to me that peace is like, is that coin? Is it something else? Is it more fungible than coin? These questions. So yeah, that just I'll look forward to hearing if that if that leads anywhere.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. We do have a question on Zoom, if everything holds.
Yeah, please. Maybe can you read?
Hey, Taija.
Masa.
I have what I think is a well, I'll just say it. What what does it mean, or how does one come to inherit a disinheritance? And seeing as you are the foremost thinker of clocks and temporality, I was wondering if that has something to do with that seemingly contradictory predicament.
So do clocks have anything? So Samasa knows me through my grad program. So let me explain why he's talking about clocks right now. Is originally my dissertation project was a history, not a history, but like thinking about timekeeping and the way that that slaves keep time. Okay, not like how they read time on the plantation, but how they sort of keep time for the world. And then it became a very different dissertation. And so that's why I have to explain this about clocks, because it seems like it's coming out of space, but it's not. In terms of inheriting a disinheritance, so the slave, the inheritance that the slave gets, if we can call it that, if we can call it an inheritance at all, is an inheritance of nothing, right? Patterson calls the slave a genealogical isolate. They are disinherited from everything, from all aspects of their culture and heritage, in both ascending and descending directions. So they're just like this thing. So what it would mean to inherit a disinheritance, oh my God.
No,
They're here?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Okay. What it means, this is very strange. What it means to inherit a disinheritance is it's blackness, right? It's really setting off my anxiety that I don't really have very often. So this is like really okay. It's to inherit a disinheritance is partus. It's to be the inheritor of nothing, of pure disinheritance. So is genealogical isolate. That's like the question. Does it have anything to do with clocks? From this vantage point today, like in 2023, I don't know. I may have told you something different in 2019, but I'm not, I need more time to think about that and like get back into that thinking about marine chronometers and so on, to actually think that through. But I suspect there's a relation to a different kind of timekeeping. That's what I would say. Thank you, Smasa.
Yeah, there is another question.
Yeah, that's right, Emmett. Thank you for putting it in the chat.
Hi, Taija. It's Parle. I think you had an amazing presentation. I'm really excited about.
Hi, Rob.
Hey, I'm excited about your forthcoming book and all of the things that you're doing in the field. I just wanted to ask a really simple question. Thinking through this particular question about disinheritance, but also thinking about your Derridian formulations as it relates to death, or death or blackness as a gift, or in the way that Derrida would perpetuate the gift of death as such. I'm wondering if you would place death in some way as this kind of inheritance that is disinherited, and death then not belonging to time in a particular way, but yet being the only kind of ground, if we're thinking about this in terms of like a ground, being like the kind of only ground that Blackness can be legitimated on, and therefore how that might, within the context of Black studies, get co-opted for death to be a kind of generativity in thinking through Blackness, time, and the gift itself. So like keeping death as kind of the antagonism, but also understanding how if death becomes a ground, then that means Blackness does have a ground and therefore makes Blackness generative, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the first way I want to respond to that is that, like, as you, I think, well know, we don't even have our deaths, right? That is something even that we are disinherited from is our own deaths. In terms of the way I think about death and debt, and inheritance. Was that a Freudian slip? Y'all will never know. The way I think about death and inheritance is through the question of debt. Through an inheritable debt to stand in the place of physical death, right? So social death is, to me, the creation of that debt. That's what natal alienation is, the creation of a kind of debt. And so what's being traded in terms of, or exchanged in exchanging slaves, is trading of life debts that are, yes, themselves generative for the social field around them. Rob, are you there?
I'm here. It went out for like a quick second, so I didn't hear your last part.
I just asked if that roughly answered, but
you stopped at debt. You stopped at social death becomes a kind of generativity in the form of debt or something like that. That's the last part.
Oh yeah, then I finished. Then you heard what I was saying in that case. I just asked if that was roughly answered your question.
The comment says yes.
Yeah, amazing. Okay.
Questions, other comments?
I had one sent from someone in the Zoom room.
Yeah, please.
So this is from Stefan, who's a grad in HistCon, now foremost thinker of maritime shipping.
Hey.
He says, Taija, thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to ask about the affordances that your work gains from its focus on the plantation as a site of analysis. I am thinking of extant work on Blackness, slavery, and finance, in which it is often the slave ship that is the analytical site for discussions like that of maritime insurance can index the slave's juridical, commodity, and financial being. While, of course, understanding the terms plantation and ship to be simultaneously concretely historical and theoretically figural in the tradition of Black critical theory, is it correct to think of your focus on the plantation as an intervention that moves focus away from the ship and the middle passage as a locus of analysis?
Thank you for the question, Stefan. And the thing is that I think this is just one piece of several sites that I actually sort of focus on. It in some areas I'm talking about the auction. In some areas I'm talking about the site of capture or the site of conception. Even though you can never see money make more money, according to Philip Goodchild. Okay, so I think through different sites. I think of this is just where I'm considering the plantation. I think of sites that are also post-emancipation. So it isn't bound solely to the site. So any critique of like the ship or the ship's belly or whatever is going to be sort of incidental. It's not like I'm taking a critique of the ship necessarily. I'm more looking at I'm looking across several sites.
Yeah, thank you so much for this impact. I think this was something you posted. I was familiar with your piece on George Jackson and citational politics.
Oh no.
No, and like I think there's a way that when I heard this talk about financial victims, like, I was curious as to what the through line would be, but I think I do see one in the way that you're talking about this sort of conceptual similarity. I think believe that there's the sort of how can there be nothing when there's something, right? What is that position? And maybe this connects to Stefan's question about the sort of sidedness of the plantation, but it strikes me that one of the this form of liquidity that you're talking about, the couriers and the slave, is present in a perhaps modified way in the prison system as well. And it translates into all of these strange things like citational politics and things like that. So I just invite you to say a little bit more about that and maybe how what you're doing in your dis around that and these other domains.
Yeah, thank you for, you know what, I've been actually waiting for someone to ask me this question because like I know I have this work on George Jackson and citational politics and insurrectionary politics and so on. And then I have this other work about whatever this is. And I've been waiting for somebody to ask me this question so I can look at you and say, I have no idea. No, I'm kidding. But the thing is I consider this, what I'm doing here with this work on finance, moneyness, to be the sort of conceptual infrastructure for the work on Jackson, Gilles Deleuze, Fanon. It's like at the beginning, I you know, as I was well trained, I was told always say that you have some stakes, even if they're bullshit, right? Say that there's some stakes to what you're political stakes to what you're doing, even if it's nonsense. And like, it's sort of not. Is like if you can't get at the infrastructural problems, you're not going to solve anything, even with insurrectionary violence, if it's not directed at the right. On Jackson, that's sort of my concern is like, is insurrectionary revolutionary violence and why we do or don't do it. And like, if you can't burn the balance sheet, you're going to end up in the same place. And that's where that's where the through line kind of goes. If you aren't going to attack the ledger, if you aren't going to attack these specific things, you will unfortunately reproduce the same thing, maybe in a different form. Maybe you'll move it, but you will end up with it again, because it's very, very capacious. So thank you for asking that question. That is sort of one of the through lines, and that's the way I conceive of them together, is that it's the conceptual infrastructure for like, okay, so answer the Leninist question, then, okay, what is to be done? Okay, do this. And I'm going to pretend that I know. Thank you.
Do we have a final question? Okay. Thank you so much, Taija.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.